great to have you guys here this morning. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. Also wanted to just give a warm welcome to anyone who's visiting us on our live stream or on our YouTube channel. If you are visiting on our YouTube channel and you're watching this video on that channel, we would just recommend that you subscribe and that you would just ring the bell to be notified for any other future content that we release on our channel. But it's great to have you guys here if you're watching us online or if you're here with us this morning. I just want to welcome any new guests. If you are new, and we would love to communicate with you this week, you can text the word guest, G-U-E-S-T, to our number 207-245-1975, and we'll reach out to you this week. So if you are new, text that word guest. Also, if you are not getting our text updates, you can text the word loop, L-O-O-P, to get our text updates regarding anything that's happening at Vineyard Church here going forward. Just wanted to mention giving as well. Thank you so much for continuing to give to the ministry of the church. Here are our updated numbers for you guys. Just wanted to continue to remind you to go to our Tithely platform, search Tithely in your phone's app store, to download that app and to begin giving to the church via Tithely. We're going to be transitioning out of PayPal into Tithely at the end of the year for good. So please do that if you haven't done that yet. It's working really well. I do it. It's awesome, convenient, very little steps, and you can recur give, and you can also cover the fees. So great way to give this morning. Also, turkeys coming up for our Thanksgiving boxes. We need 150 turkeys. So please begin to start going out to the supermarkets and grabbing those turkeys for us as we start to prepare our boxes. We're not going to receive those turkeys. We're asking you to hold on to those turkeys until the week before we prepare them. But you can go out and get them anytime, so we want to just encourage you to do that. And lastly is this. We have a time change coming up. Again, we just made a switch to do an 8:30 and a 10:30 service. And now with our Phase 4 reopening, we have decided to move to a 10 o'clock service here each and every Sunday. We'll be sending out an email regarding the reasoning for that. We'll also be sending out a video as well. There should be a video on our Facebook page, both on the EFAM group and on our regular page, just describing to you exactly why it is that we came to this decision, why we felt it was important to make yet another change to when we're meeting, all right? So let's jump in this morning to our series called Fulfilled, looking at the prophetic feasts that God gave Israel in the Old Testament. And this week, we get to talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So I'm really excited about doing this. We just spent 3 weeks on Passover, and now it's time to look at the Feast of Unleavened Bread and how that points to Christ. So here's the idea, is that we are looking at types in the Old Testament and how they point to Christ. So that the idea is that God had instituted these feasts for his people as a way to remember what he did, but ultimately he instituted these feasts to point to something greater, right? So the type would be the feast, the lesser, and Jesus would be the greater, which is what the fulfillment is. So Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets. He talks about that with a couple people we find in Luke chapter 24. He says to them, I'm going to tell you all those things about me in the law and the prophets. He talks about how he shares with them everything concerning him and how he fulfills everything, starting with Moses all the way through the prophets. So the idea is that everything about the Old Testament points to Christ. And so we're looking at the feasts in the same way. So unleavened bread, here we go. As you guys know, unleavened bread, well, maybe you don't know. We'll just kind of put this out there really quick, some really quick facts. The Feast of Unleavened Bread occurred on the 15th of Nisan. And so we know from the last couple of weeks that Passover was always at twilight at the end of the day, celebrated on the 14th. So the very next day was the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread would go on for 7 days. So it would start on the 15th and it would end on the 21st. And God had appointed the first and the last day of this feast as holy convocations and Sabbath days. So there were days of rest, the first and the last. But this feast would start on the 15th, and it would be for a whole week. And the people of Israel would be required not to eat leavened bread during this time. They were not able to do any work, and they would be able to prepare certain things. It wasn't totally a Sabbath day on the first and the last day, but it was pretty close. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Unleavened bread just memorializes, right, points to the actual day in which Israel leaves Egypt. So that day, the 15th, is the actual day that they leave. Passover happens on the 14th. They leave on the 15th. So, let's talk about leavened bread for a moment. Leavened bread or unleavened bread is basically bread that doesn't rise. It doesn't have a leavening or a rising agent in it. Typically, that agent would be yeast. Yeast would be, kneaded into the dough, and when it would be baked, the dough would rise, and you would have this nice fluffy loaf of bread. But God, in this feast, or during the Passover, had commanded his people to eat this Passover meal with unleavened bread. And so we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread to memorialize that command. So here's a couple key takeaways this morning. First is this, is that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the type, Jesus is the fulfillment, and these are two really important takeaways that we have to understand. The Passover, which is what we just celebrated, the Passover speaks to our condition, or the condition of Israel. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Passover deals with the position of Israel and the position of us before God. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread speaks to our condition. So Passover speaks to our position, how we are viewed by God. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread deals with our condition. Really important to keep those two principles in mind when we talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread and how it points to Christ, how Jesus fulfills it. Okay? So let's look at a couple passages regarding the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're going to start in Leviticus chapter 23. And we're going to start in verse 6. This is really short. We're going to go to Exodus and learn a little bit more about what the Feast of Unleavened Bread looked like. Verse 6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no ordinary work, but you shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. So those 2 days, the first and the last, were Sabbath days. No ordinary work was to be done. He did make some provisions for prepping food, as we'll see in a minute. But for the most part, it was like a Sabbath. Also, they were to provide offerings or sacrifices. Now, this didn't happen, obviously, until they got into the land and they had the place of sacrifice. But they were required during this time, and they were shown what to sacrifice and to offer in Numbers chapter 28. If you wanted to go there at some point, I think it's Numbers chapter 28. God lists all of the offerings and the sacrifices that the Israelites would have to do in their worship to God. They did, daily sacrifices, monthly sacrifices, and then they had their sacrifices that centered around their feasts. So there had to be some type of sacrifice going on as well, okay? So let's go over to Exodus chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 8 really quick, and then we're going to jump over to verse 11. And then we're going to jump into a little bit further down in chapter 12. So verse 8 says this, they shall eat the flesh, right? We talked about this, that night, roasted on the fire. So they had to eat the Passover lamb roasted on the fire. And the reason why they had to do that was because they had to make sure that when they consumed the meat, there was no blood left in it. And roasting it was the best way to ensure that they were not eating meat with blood still in it, because that was forbidden by God. So you had to eat the flesh that night of the Passover lamb, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Let's turn over to verse 11. Same chapter. Goes on to say this, in this manner you shall eat it. With your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So there's this sense that when they were going to engage in this meal, that it was not going to be a meal that they were just going to really sit down and enjoy. It was a meal that they were going to eat quickly. So that's the reason why God had commanded them to eat this meal with unleavened bread. Because if you eat it with leavened bread, if you prepared the meal with leavened bread, it would take longer. You would have to wait for the dough to rise, and the preparation time and the baking time would be longer than if you were going to eat the meal with unleavened bread. It was much easier to prepare. And God was wanting his people to understand that this meal was going to have to be eaten and shared quickly. So the sandals were on your feet. You were like ready to go. It was like, we are eating this meal. God is going to come, and strike down every firstborn in the land. And then at that point, it was time to go. So unleavened bread was commanded for the people of Israel to eat during this meal for that very purpose. Let's skip down to verse 14 in Exodus chapter 12. It says, this day shall be for you a memorial day. Remember this is really important. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, as a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. So this goes on forever. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day, you shall remove leaven from your home. Very important. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, the person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day, you shall hold a holy assembly, a holy convocation, and on the seventh day, a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days. But what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared for you. So what is God saying? He's saying, there's basically no ordinary work to be done except for the preparation of food for you to consume. See, on the Sabbath, on a regular Sabbath, on a Saturday, they would not even be allowed to prepare food. So the Friday would be their day of preparation, where they would prepare all of their food so that they would not do any work on the Saturday. And so often Friday was synonymous with this idea of preparation. Friday, the day of the week, Friday would a lot of times, even in the New Testament, would be referred to as the day of preparation. Those two things were interchangeable. They were synonymous because it was every Friday that they had to prepare their meals for Saturday, because they were forbidden to prepare anything on Saturday because it was considered work. So these two convocations, the first day and the last day of this feast, God made an exception and said, hey, no ordinary work except the preparation of your food. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days, no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places, you shall eat unleavened bread. So he's repeating a lot here. There's a repetitive nature to this command. And the Lord is highlighting a couple things when he's talking about how they're supposed to observe this feast called unleavened bread. One of the things that he says, one of the things that he's highlighting is this idea of remembrance. That this feast was to cause you to remember something. So often in our culture, we have holidays that cause us to remember something. We talked about how in the seasons, when the seasons come and go, right? We talked about a couple weeks ago how when the season of winter comes, right? The snow comes and the cold comes, it begins to remind us of the Christmas season. And even in the summer, coming out of summer and seeing the change of temperature and the days shorten and the leaves falling and the leaves changing color, it begins to remind us of Thanksgiving. And in the summertime, when the weather starts to get warmer, you know, oftentimes we think of summer and 4th of July or Memorial Day. And God was so adamant about his people not forgetting what he had done that he institutes these feasts so that they would never forget the mighty work of God, that he delivered them from Egypt with a mighty hand. So he's really big on remembrance. He wanted them to always keep this feast and keep the celebration so that they could remember who he was and what he did and who he is. So what are some of the things he wanted them to remember? One of the things was their deliverance. He wanted them to remember their deliverance and how he delivered them. Remember, we talked about that when they ate the meal right before they were delivered out of Egypt, God said, you got to eat this in a particular way. You got to eat it with unleavened bread, because you don't have time for your bread to rise. You got to eat it with your sandals on your feet, your belt fastened, and your staff in your hand, right? It was, we were ready to go. I delivered you in haste. I delivered you quickly. And so when you eat unleavened, when you participate in this feast of unleavened bread, it's supposed to remind you of how I delivered you. I delivered you in haste. I delivered you through the land of Egypt, and I did it by my mighty hand, and I did it quickly. He also wants his people to remember his covenant, his promise. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was to remind his people of the promise that he has kept for them. That he's entered into a covenant with his people, and that it's a covenant that he will never break. And it's a covenant that he will always be faithful to. And that covenant was to deliver them from where they were into the land in which he had provided for them already. A land flowing with milk and honey. If we look at chapter 13 in Exodus, this is what it records. This is after they come out of the land. This is after, before the Red Sea, but they are out of Egypt. This is what it says. And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, basically the land of Canaan, the land of promise, what I've promised you, which he swore to your fathers, the covenant, the promise, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep the service in this month. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread in this month. So when you get into the land, you have to remember that this feast is very, very important. Why? Because it symbolizes and reminds you of my covenant with you. It symbolizes my promise that I've spoken over you, that I will do by my mighty hand what I said I was going to do. So he wanted them to remember through this feast his deliverance, but also his covenant. He also wanted them to understand and remember their identity. We know that God had called a people to himself, that when he was going to take them out of Egypt, he said in Exodus chapter 6, I think, that he was going to call a people to himself. And he was going to do that through the Passover. So, when they come out of the land, God is saying, I have brought you into a new reality with me. I have created in you a new identity. I have delivered you into a new life with me, a life now on a journey to the land in which I have promised you in my covenant with you. God wanted to remind them of the rebirthing of a nation out of Egypt, a new identity. He knew that through this feast, if they could keep this feast, if they could remember, memorialize what he had done, that they would never forget who they were, a people in covenant relationship with their God. So he wanted them to remember their deliverance, his covenant, their identity as a rebirth nation. And he also wanted them to remember the bitterness of their slavery. So he asked them to, commands them to eat the meal, eat the Passover with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. These two things were not used to stress the delight of eating the meal. These two things, these two items, the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs, were for a purpose. They were to focus the eater's attention on the purpose of the meal. The purpose of the meal, or part of the purpose of the meal, was for them to remember the bitterness of their slavery. When you think about unleavened bread, it's like crackers. I mean, it's not soft. It's not nice and puffy and airy. You know, it doesn't have the same taste as risen or leavened bread. You know, it's flat. It's kind of bland. You know, and it's harder. You know, if you had a choice between leavened bread and unleavened bread, you'd choose the unleavened bread. I mean, I love rye. I love sourdough. I don't eat a lot of bread, but man, sourdough, man, that is like, we'll eat sourdough like once a month. Shanna will just have this craving for sourdough. She'll be like, can you just pick up some When Pigs Fly sourdough sometimes? And we'll like eat sourdough with soup, and we'll like eat like half the loaf, almost a whole loaf in one sitting because it's so good. Unleavened bread was never provided. Bitter herbs were not provided for the delight of the meal. They were provided to remind the eater of the purpose of the meal. So that when they would eat the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs, they would be reminded of what God had delivered them from. Also, God highlights this idea of remembrance in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but he also highlights this idea of removal. Remembrance and removal. He removes them from the land. But what he instructs them to do in preparation for the feast, what he instructs them to do in preparation for the Passover, is he says to them, I need you not only to not eat unleavened bread or consume it, but it actually needs to be rid from your home. You cannot even have it found in your home. Like, it wasn't enough just to not eat bread without leaven. But there actually couldn't be any residing in your home. There should be no trace of it anywhere. I think it was kind of a hedge, you know, for God. It was, I don't even want you to unintentionally consume it, because this is how important I treat my covenant with you. That you need to live in obedience to my covenant in a way that I've called you to, with no exception. And I don't even want you to unintentionally be in violation of my covenant. Because what did he say? Is if you eat unleavened bread during this time, if you prepare bread with leaven in it, you'll be cut off from Israel. Not only that, if any leaven is found in your home, you will also be cut off from Israel. It speaks to the holiness of his covenant. It speaks to the seriousness that God takes in his relationship with his people. It speaks to the intimacy in which he wants to live with his people, that in the obedience of his commands over our lives and his will for our lives, in that, in our ability to surrender to that, God is honored. But if we can't, he's dishonored. And so he says, if you're going to have a relationship with me, if you are going to receive the benefits of me being your God, then it is absolutely critical that you live in accord with my perfect will for your life. And what did that look like? In the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it looked like doing what God had asked, which is completely removing leaven from your home, as well as not consuming it. So you were not even close. There was no way you could even unintentionally violate his command for you. So consuming leaven was prohibited, and not only that, the very existence of leaven in the home was also prohibited. I mean, I can imagine some of the families, some of the kids just going around in their clothing, checking their clothing. Searching like high and low in the kitchen, just looking for every little speck of old bread that may have had leaven in it and cleaning it out. It's really interesting because, this feast happened, in the spring. And it's really interesting because, we think of this idea of spring cleaning, even in our own culture, right? There's this idea that as we come through winter and everything's bottled up, we begin to open the windows, and we're a little bit more vigilant about, cleaning out our houses and, cleaning out all the dust. And for them, it was cleaning out the leaven. It was searching high and low. It was this idea that they were ridding themselves of something that was forbidden by God in this season. And so they would participate in this spring cleaning kind of event in preparation for the feast, so that nothing would be found in their homes. So how does this point to Jesus? How does Jesus come? How does this connect with Christ? Because he comes to fulfill the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But how does he do that? In order for us to understand that, we have to understand how leaven is viewed in the New Testament. There's a couple different things that we can look at in the New Testament that gives us a picture of how leaven was viewed in the New Testament. Jesus did use the idea and the understanding of leaven and what it did in a positive way in the New Testament, but the prevailing idea is that whenever leaven was referred to in the New Testament, it was always in a negative sense. Two things we have to understand about how leaven was used in the New Testament, or two things we have to understand about leaven and its properties. Leaven, even in small amounts, had very profound effects. A very little bit of leaven in a lump could allow the dough to rise. Very little leaven produced great or profound results. That it did not take much leaven to produce the effect that it had on whatever it is it was added to. Also, leaven was associated with pride or being puffed up. And really in connection with that, with sin. Leaven was this symbol used in the Old Testament to refer to pride or being puffed up or making yourself more than you are, or corruption or sin. That's how leaven was really looked at in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus talks about leaven for a moment with his disciples, and his disciples were a little bit confused about what he was saying, but he refers this word leaven, he uses this word leaven in connection with the teaching of the Pharisees. In chapter 16, they have this interaction with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are demanding Jesus for a sign. They want him to show them a sign that he is truly sent from God. And Jesus says, a generation that is corrupt is the only one that looks for a sign. The only sign that will be given to you is the sign of Jonah. And they leave the presence of the Pharisees and they go they cross over a body of water, and Jesus says to them, when they get to the other side, he says, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the disciples were taking him literally. They were basically saying, well, we don't eat bread that's provided by the teachers of the law. We don't eat their bread. And they were kind of confused. And Jesus said to them, no, I'm not talking about their bread. I'm talking about their teaching. That their teaching is not of God. Their teaching is corrupt. They're teaching tradition, right, over God's law. They've taken the law of God and they've added their own tradition to it, and they've made it all about their tradition. And so that the focus on God's law as a form of worship to him has been completely disregarded, because now all they do is focus on their tradition. And he said to them, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples actually got it. They understood, oh, you're talking about the teaching of them. And Jesus says, yes. So the idea is this, is that the leaven of the Pharisees was their corrupt teaching. And so what Jesus is saying is a little bit of leaven, right? The leaven of their teaching, right? Which seems small and insignificant at the time. If you allow it to continue, if you allow it to grow, it will begin to consume, and it will begin to have a large effect on you and how you view God. So Jesus was very clear, equating leaven in the process of what leaven does with corrupt teaching of the Pharisees. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 7 and 9, Paul talks about this as well. The church was trying to be convinced, the church in Galatia was trying to be convinced that they were not saved solely by the work of Christ on the cross, that they were also had to be saved by observing the law. And Paul had to come in and refute this teaching and say, no, that's not the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel is not the work of the cross plus. It was just Jesus' unmerited favor for you, poured out as a sacrifice for you in your place on the cross. And so Paul is refuting this teaching, and he says to them, you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Paul here is referring to deception, and he's equating the idea of leaven with deception. False teaching is like leaven, that it only takes a little bit to have an effect, to have a profound effect on you or on the church. So be careful. Don't accept this false teaching, because if you do, and if you do accept it, it's like leaven. Just a little portion of it, just a small piece of it can have such a profound effect on your faith. And so he equates this idea of leaven with deception. So we see leaven is always usually typically being referred to in the New Testament as something negative. And here's really where it hammers home. And here's where we can really see how it points to Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 through 8. Paul says this, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Here we go again. So now it's referred to and equated to boasting or pride. And really it's referring to a life lived in sin outside of our ability or our desire to worship God for who he is. He says, cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Here's how Christ is connected with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Paul is saying that we are no longer a lump of leaven, that our lives are no longer a lump of leaven. It is a new lump that is unleavened. Unleavened. We have been given the opportunity through the sacrifice of Christ and his righteousness imputed to us through his work. We have been given the opportunity to live a life free from the effects and the control of sin. Paul's saying, why are you boasting? Why are you prideful? Why are you living in disobedience to God? Why are you living, satisfying the desires of your own selfish nature? Why are you doing this? Why are you operating this way? No, you are not supposed to operate this way anymore. Why? Because you have been given a new life. You have been given new identity. You are not the old lump. You are not the leavened lump anymore. You are a new lump that is unleavened. And how are you a new lump that's unleavened? Right here. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So this is all sort of language, Passover lamb language, Passover feast, unleavened bread language. Christ is the sacrifice. He's the one that positions us before God so that we can live a life that's holy to God. When we live a life understanding that we are a new lump unleavened, it means that we are no longer under the power or under the control or the effect of our pride, of our boasting, that we now live a life that is fully honoring the one who died for us. That is through his sacrifice that we become unleavened. Remember what we talked about? Passover deals with our position, right? The cross deals with our position before God. Unleavened bread, the feast, deals with our condition. So we are to live a life where we are constantly evaluating our lives to see if we are living in accord with what we have been given through the cross. So he says, let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So in light of Christ's cross, in light of the work of the cross and Christ's sacrifice, what is he saying? He's saying, live a life and become what Christ paid for. We should act in accord with who we have become. We have become a new lump, unleavened, because of the work of the cross. So now we must act in accord with what we have become. Check this out. 1 John chapter 1, verse 8. It says, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So here's this term again that we're talking about when we're talking about the idea of unleavened bread. The Israelites had to cleanse their home of any leaven. And we see in the New Testament that leaven is being associated with pride, with boasting, with basically leading a sinful life. And so the connection here is that through Christ's sacrifice, just as the Israelites had to clean out the leaven from their homes, so it is with us that we can evaluate our lives to make sure that Jesus is continually cleansing our life of sin through the cross, so that we can now live a life holy and honoring to God. because now we are cleansed from that old leaven. John 6:31. Jesus brings a little bit more clarity and connection to who he is by proclaiming this. John 6:31, Jesus says that the bread from heaven, or the bread of God, comes from heaven and gives life to the world. And that bread is me. That I am the bread of heaven. I am the bread that God has sent to give life to the world. And so my bread that you consume, that you partake of, if you partake of my life, if you put your faith in me and you partake in my life and you eat the bread that I provide, it will be life to you. Because my bread is the greater bread. See, the unleavened bread that the Israelites were commanded to eat, that was bread that signified, right, that symbolized, that pointed to their deliverance, pointed to their salvation. That bread, that unleavened bread, was free from leaven. And we know in the New Testament that leaven symbolized pride and sin. And so that bread that the Israelites ate symbolized their deliverance, but it was pointing to the greater bread, which is Christ, who comes as the bread of heaven, who gives life to the world. See, the Feast of Unleavened Bread represents our response to the Lord's deliverance from our sin. Our response to his deliverance should be obedience to a life lived that is holy before the Lord. So our response to what he's done should be to live a life holy before him. That we should live a life where we're continually cleansing out the leaven, continually living a life before God that's honoring to him. So our proper response, the only response that we have to the cross, to our deliverance, to our position now that is established through the power of Jesus' work, our only response is, God, I get the opportunity to live a life honoring you. Like, that is the most amazing opportunity that I have, that my life lived for you in holiness, for holiness, set apart for you, is an honor. My life lived for you is an honor. It should never be a burden. It should never be something that that brings a sense of guilt or condemnation to. Like, I should never live in a place of being defeated because I can't live a life of holiness before God, because Christ has made it available through his cross. So my proper response to God is, in light of the cross and the work for me on my behalf, it is my honor and my great pleasure to live a life of holiness before you. 1 Peter chapter 1 gives us this command. 1 Peter chapter 1, 13 through 19 says this: Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. What is Peter saying? You think you're experiencing grace now? Wait till he comes in his fullness. Wait till he comes to judge the world. Wait till he comes and he marries his bride, the church. You think you're experiencing grace now? Wait till that day. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Christ. So there is an even greater amount and dispensation of grace that's going to be poured out over us that we can experience when we fully see the revealed Christ on the day of his coming, when he marries his bride, the church. And then he says this, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. Don't live a life that you used to live. Don't live a life where you were ignorant of the presence of God. Don't live a life ignorant to the work of the cross. Don't live a life that you used to live when you had no idea or understanding about God's immense amount of unfailing love and grace over you. Don't go back to that. Do not be conformed to that. But as he who called you is holy, he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And so our proper response to the salvation that has been gifted to us is to live a life holy before God. That it is our honor and our great pleasure to do that in response to him, because that is what he deserves. Yahweh was saying the same thing in the Feast of Passover. He says, I am delivering you out of the land, and I am bringing salvation upon my people. And your response to that act that I am doing is that you keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You make sure that you clean out the leaven in your own home. You make sure that you do not consume leaven in your diet for the next week. You will be holy as I am holy. And so not only are we supposed to live a holy life for a week, but we are supposed to live a holy life perpetually before God. And it is only through the work of Christ that is even made available and made possible. So Christ becomes the true bread that the unleavened bread points to. He becomes the bread of life. And it is with this bread that we consume and partake of. It is in this bread, it is in this partaking that we can live holy lives before the Lord. Because he's called us to live set-apart lives. We are set apart for his good pleasure. We're set apart for his perfect will. We're set apart for his purposes on the earth. We're set apart for an intimate relationship with God where we know him and love him and pursue him, and we see his mighty hand moving in the lives around us, in our lives. We see his mighty hand moving in our communities, in our families. And now our response to that work is a holy life lived before him. It is our honor and great pleasure to do that. Point of application is this, and this is where I'll end. We have been redeemed, which is the Passover, to live holy lives set apart for God, which is represented in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Feast of Passover, we are redeemed, and our response, just as the Israelites responded to God by cleaning out all of the leaven from their homes and not consuming it in their bodies, our response to that redemption, to that salvation, is a holy life lived for God, represented in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's amazing. That's amazing. Father, I just thank you that you give us the ability, that it's through your work, it's through your power, it's through your spirit that lives in us that we get to live holy lives before you, honoring you, living in complete surrender and obedience to you in your call in our lives. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining us this week. Next week, we'll be looking at the Feast of First Fruits. Hope you can join us. Have a great week.